So one of the benefits, or one of the things that we can certainly do in the schema, if we piggyback off the DAS schema, is we can mark certain fields as optional as well. Obviously, if we start getting a schema that the entire thing's optional, it's kind of like, well, what's the point, you know? So there's some kind of tipping point there.
Yeah, I think the thing that comes to mind as I think about sharing with Dast is that I feel like they have a very stable platform that they're unlikely to change in the future extensively, whereas ours is probably a little different from that. You know, as we integrate and then also, you know, start expanding the tool with features, it's more likely that our version of the schema will need to be iterated over. And so I guess one thing to think about is if that would slow us down, the idea of now having to negotiate schema changes and have updates for Dast as well as for API Fuzzer.
Right. The upside to piggybacking off one of the existing schemas is anything that's in those schemas that's exposed on a Rails application, we basically get for free. So if we populate certain fields, those are going to show up in Rails, no problem. Anything that we have in our own schema is not going to show up in Rails without additional work. I guess that's true for anything we add to the DAS schema too, right? If we add a new field, that's not going to show up. Someone's going to have to go in and add that to Rails. So I guess that's a long way of saying we shouldn't diverge just for the sake of diverging, right? Like if there's things that we can inherit, that's going to give us a lot more stuff on the Rails side for free.
Yeah, I think that you hit a great point about reusability of UI components. And so I guess that the next thing is, you know, do we expect to diverge the UI or, you know, keep it similar to what DAS is doing? You know, I think if we're diverging the UI, then again, we're kind of in a position where, you know, diverging the schema probably fits in with that plan. You know, also I wonder, like from a UI perspective, even if we don't have the same schema, you know, does that, I mean, even if we have our own processor for the report, could we not just populate fields that translate? Perhaps there's a mapping that we have that could fulfill the UI component requirements.
Right.
I don't know. I definitely see your point though about reusing the DAS stuff.
So there's overlap between Dast and the API fuzzing, and then there's also overlap between API fuzzing and the coverage-based fuzzing. And so it's kind of an area I hadn't really considered too much, is extending Dast. I was focusing a lot more on the similarities between coverage-based fuzzing and API fuzzing, because then we would reuse similar components. We have a similar type of goal with what we're collecting in those reports. But I think there is definitely things that we should reuse and carry over, either between existing schemas or between the two different types of fuzzers.
So, an idea I could...
when you were talking about...
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask if when you were talking about extending DAS schema, were we talking about that specifically from the perspective of API fuzzing or for both of them?
So the way that I kind of connected these is DAS is close to the API fuzzing. So that's a schema. And then the coverage guided fuzzing is a different schema. If anything, the coverage guided fuzzing might get closer to our SAST schema. And so potentially extending a SAST schema to incorporate things in the coverage guided fuzzing. So instead of trying to line up coverage guided and API, which I think are more different, I think they cluster better. Coverage and SAST cluster better, and then DAS and API cluster really well.
So probably the first thing we want to do for the kind of the DAST versus, you know, using it versus extending it versus having our own is to have me sit down and do a rough look at what fields translate to our tool, what fields are left out, and then what in the immediate feature we might be adding to it. And let's just get a handle on how well it works. But I think that the big thing I want an answer today is if we're going to have one holistic API or fuzzing spec, and it sounds like that's no, which is great. Does that relieves the pressure on me a bit for helping with the coverage guided one?
Yeah. I mean, I think if we try to build off the DAST, that's going to make the Peach integration a lot easier.
Yeah.
And then really, like you're saying, what we have to do is look at DAST, or, you look at DAST and say, okay, that's going to cover 80% of the fields that Peach provides. Where those 20% of those extra fields going to go? And then we can add a merge request to add those. And then, we'll need to extend the Rails application to support those.
So one idea I wanted to float out there and see what you all thought. Rather than extending completely off of one schema, what if we broke down portions of the schema into blocks and then included those into multiple places, right? Like we don't have to strictly extend DAST, but we could inherit one portion which is also in DAST in coverage and SASP, what have you. And then that would let us kind of mix and match the schema definition based on the use cases that those blocks support, rather than trying to cram everything into one schema.
Yeah, Sam, I think that's a great point. And I haven't looked technically at how all this is put together, but my understanding is that's actually how some of the schemas are working today. So like SAS, DAS are incorporating the vulnerabilities definition. So we would do the same thing.
Yeah.
We would just incorporate the definition. So it does reuse exactly like you're saying, blocks. I don't know what they're called in the schema definition, but
yeah, because we're using JSON schema to define all of this, and that's how we're doing the common report schema, right? So it's essentially a schema inside of a schema, and so you would just mix and match those as you needed them.
One of the really big benefits I think we get out of that is we would be able to add support for locations, or okay, so if we had common definitions for items, the first example that came to mind was a location within the project, right? Then we can use that and have common UI components that know how to work on that field, and it's not specific to a report, right? And that I'm loving that idea. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Like if you're reusing the location, perhaps if in the case of like DAST or API fuzzing and it's a HTTP URL, or in the case of code and it's a line number, if we're reusing that across our tools and it's a line number and a path to that code, theoretically, right, you can click on that and it takes you to that part of the repo. As opposed to if we try to redefine it for every tool, then that's a huge amount of work to figure out how to link those and connect all of it.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, and we wouldn't prioritize those sorts of UI enhancements for fuzzing most likely, but a group like Threat Insights that's focused on the common experience might prioritize those, so we could get those benefits for free.
Okay, so just kind of to summarize what I think I'm hearing, which is that we're going to look at the DAS schema and how we want to extend that or build on top of that for the API fuzzing. Is that fair?
Sounds good.
And then for the coverage guided fuzzing, how do we want to approach that? Do we want to try to work off SAST? I'm not sure where, I know Evgeny's got some extensions right now. I'm not sure if that's based off the MR on the schema or whether those are just things that have been added.
I'm pretty sure it's not based on the schema MR. I think his current work that he's been doing is the intention is that he will update it with whatever we come up with in the schema MR.
Okay. So do we have a preference in terms of trying to build that off SAST, or whether we should build that off just kind of its own fuzzing?
Let's see. I definitely think we should reuse common definitions. Whatever way we go, I definitely think we need to do that. I'm kind of familiar with the SAS one, but we need to add extra fields to it. So for example, the backtrace, right? Since we are running the program live, we'll have extra information like that. the backtrace, maybe if we want to save like registers of the program when it crashed, that type of thing, which SAST itself will not have at all. It's not running it. It's static, right? So it's looking at the SAS schema, it's very simple. Basically has the location of the vulnerabilities as well as all of the common fields. I don't know that we would get too much extra by, let's see. I think I'd prefer to extend the SAS one instead of add optional fields to it.
Yeah, so I mean, it goes back to, I'm looking at the SAS, we've got a start line, end line, class, method, things like that, that if we're able to use that, and if the fuzzing knows that information, again, if the vulnerability dashboard or the security dashboard links that information, we'd get some of that functionality.
Yeah.
So if we were to extend that definition, I guess what we would try to do is use the same names and values.
Yes. Yeah. So we would keep a location block, right? But it's, so let's say we don't have symbols on the target that we're fuzzing. We're not going to have full locations, but we may know it's this offset in this module, right? To me, that is something that I would want to add in as the location of the vulnerability is whatever information we have, even if it's not line or source based. And to me, that's where the difference between the basic location that is source based and the other types come in. Oh, something else.
Could it make
I was
sense that
thinking
we
of too.
put the location as a hex address as a new field rather than try and overload the location that's talking about source code? Because then what we could do, the UIs could display, you know, if source code line present, display that, else display hex address. But if we build the UIs around this data will always be source files and lines, and then we give it a hex address, that might look funky in the UI because it's going to be displaying a different type of data than it's expecting. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I do. Let's see. I'm looking up a link. I added in the MR that I made for I guess my first stab at having a fuzz schema. In JSON schema, you can have optional different types where a location object needs to be one of these types of objects, right? That's the way I was going with that end goal in mind, where if the location dot type field equals source, then display it like this. If not, display it like this. I'm trying to find the exact
Okay, got it.
And okay, here we go. This one. I'll put that in. I'll drop it in the chat. I'm not sure where to put it in the document right now.
Got it. So not reusing like the start line, end line fields, but if it's the given type, use the correct field, which would be new for this case. Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and it would piggyback off of the current SAST format. How the UI implements it, of course, would be up to them, but they could say if the location.type field doesn't exist, then assume it's source, right?
Right.
Otherwise, you know, use the type and know it's a module location, or well, the code that I linked also has endpoint location, but we're not doing that in the same schema, so ignore that. Oh, I did want to say that DAST and API fuzzing, I think any improvements we add to the DAST schema because of API fuzzing will only enhance the DAST schema itself, and we could probably use it with actual DAST results. And I don't think that same type of relationship exists with the extending the SAS schema and the coverage guided fuzzing. Yeah, because because we are running a live program, you will never get those types of values from SAST.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And Sam, you had a question this morning, I think, about HAR files. and whether Dast is using HAR files. So some of the same stuff that we're looking at on the API fuzzing is stuff that we can bring over to Dast as well. It's not in the schema, but yeah, I agree, James. There's very much a, each one's kind of advance the other tool.
All right, I'm gonna have to drop off to get to an interview.
Yep, sounds great. Thanks, Mike. But you're good to go for what we need?
Yeah, I have enough. Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Awesome.
Okay, so I think Evgeny might join us in 10 minutes. But so in terms of the approach for what we want to do for coverage guided fuzzing, so do we want to work off this MR that has been started, or do we want to restart this MR?
Doesn't really matter to me. My main intention with the MR was just to have something in place and start putting it into the project so we can start talking about it. So if we remake it from scratch with our current perspective, that's totally fine with me.
So I'm just trying to look at what we've got here and what we would change. So what are the deltas for this to build off of the SAST? Or is it pulling a bunch of the SAS blocks right now?
Right now it is not pulling in the SAS box. Let's see. So there is did I add it? No, I didn't add. So at the top of the document, there's the existing schemas, and I'm going to add the common schema. So the Dast, all of these specific schema types inherit from the common schema. And is this? Okay. Where is it? SAS. Oh, no, I had it.
Do you want to share out your screen? That might be easier to follow what you're looking at.
All right. Yep. And here we go. All right. So the common schema, I just added that link, is the one that all of them extend from.
Yep.
And, nope, that is not the common schema. Dang it. Security report. This is it. Update that again. All right. And this is one that all of them extend from, right? And this is where you have information about the analyzer type, the name, and if you want to see the full expanded versions where you don't have the includes, if you go to the dist folder instead of source, then you'll see the full schema that all of them use, right? So this is the full SAS schema with everything.
And so the dist folder is flattening out
Yes.
the schema, basically. Okay.
Exactly. And so you were talking about the differences. So here's the SAS report format. And the only addition that it adds on top of the common format is the location, right?
Okay, so SAST is the common plus the location. Yep.
Exactly. And here's where it includes the common one.
Yep.
And then everything else is extensions to it. And so these, and the merge request.
Does it override the location or does it add to it?
That's a good question. Let's see. This was, let's go with security. Oh, whoops. Did not exist.
And we've been meaning to do a brown bag on this repo for a while.
Oh, yeah? It doesn't exist. Yeah.
Okay. So it just adds it.
Yep.
So then the question is the fuzz report.
Yeah.
Which more specifically is coverage guiding report. And we need either to pull from SAS, which would, so we could inherit from SAS, which would include their location object.
Yeah.
Or we could inherit from common and then redefine our location object.
Yep, exactly. And inheriting from SAS also means any changes to the SAS schema will also automatically be put into the fuzzing one, with whatever pros and cons that means, right? Yep. But also something for us to remember. So yeah, this is all I added here was the location object and then a stack trace object and the target, since it will be specific to a target binary, right? Yep. We had talked about how you could build multiple targets and have different jobs to fuzz those targets. That's why I added that in there. Okay. And those are the three fields it adds. And that's it. So it's really not too different from SAS, except it works with module locations and has a stack trace and an extra field to record the target name.
Okay, cool. And then so the file location, you've got it's file, start line, end line.
Yeah.
And what is this? What does SAST have for location?
So this is exactly the same as the SAS one, minus the type field. So if we look at the SAS one, we have the same thing, file, start line, end line, class, method,
Right.
except it doesn't have the type that says this is a file location type.
Can you flip between those real quick?
Rather than
Yeah.
this being SAST, could we refactor this block
There we
out
go.
into a schema component? Because this doesn't, to me, sound like it's a SAS specific thing, right? This seems like a generic way to define a location in source code or the repo.
Exactly, which is one reason why I really like pulling out these common definitions, because I think they are used in other places like dependency scanning or I thought I saw it somewhere else. There was also other location objects that were custom added, right? So I think we definitely should pull these out, and then to me it makes sense to add this type field and then have a switch like this where you could say a generic location object looks like this and it's one of these things, right? But I guess we won't have endpoint location. It's more these.
So on the right, you have file location, which is adding type object description. So it's adding a type.
So ignore these parts. This is specific to the JSON schema, saying the file location object definition. This is metadata about the object itself, like the definition, right?
Yep.
So the type is an object, this is a description, and these properties contains the actual fields.
Yep.
I actually really hate working directly in JSON schema. So that's why in the issue, I did have the issue. Okay. In the issue itself, I had some code to simplify it.
Yeah.
So I don't have to think about all of these type and description and properties. Then I could say a version is a string, right? So I prefer to write them like this, which then generates the JSON schema. And anyways.
Is that a format for another tool that can then render the schema, or were you using that as more shorthand for your own thoughts?
So this is actual code. I wrote code that works with this, which is this. And it's very straightforward. I do this pretty much every time I need to work with JSON schema because I hate writing definitions that look like this. But yeah, it does make it a lot easier to look at. Yeah, so I have this code and then I put this code right here and then generate it. And then it spits something like this out.
Got it.
That's cool.
Yeah. But yeah, let's see.
So just the difference between these two that's in SAST and fuzzing. That's what I was just trying to, because how would we go about moving that into a shared definition?
Okay, so we would go about it by, let's see, I think we could have a common definitions JSON where all it does is define things. It has definitions blocks, right? So we would include the common definitions just like we do here into here, and then reference them in this part. So here where we say the location is ref definitions location, this would be sourced from some common definitions JSON file instead of being defined locally. Yep. And we would do the same thing over here.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, at the very least, we could do that with the SAST schema, and it would have no impact, right? We could actually just take line 20 through whatever it is, 46 or somewhere around there. Pull that into a shared library. That should have no impact. And then the next question is, okay, that definition that's defined that's starting to get defined on line 20 on the left, and then the definition you have on line 40. What's the difference between these? So
the difference between the two is I added this type field, which is not this type field, this one.
I
says,
see.
The type, so you would have
the type of location as a file.
Exactly, yeah. So
right, which SAS should be able to handle that. Like SAS should There may be a small code change for them, but they should be able to handle that without a problem.
Yep,
It
exactly.
would just be hard coded for them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And and this is where I was saying we could make it work with older SAS reports as well. If we assume that if the type field, this type file is missing, then just assume it's file, right?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had a brainstorming. I don't know if you were on that about that. So what we would do is we can bump the version number on the schema, make that a required. We could make that a required field, and that's how we handle the versioning on the schema, and then the Rails application would say, okay, I can accept the previous version. If I'm dealing with the previous version, I know that this needs to get injected, basically.
Nice. Yeah.
So Rails is responsible for exactly that logic that you're talking about.
Okay. Man, fantastic.
Cool. So I think that makes sense to pull this out into a library, add the constant field, make it a required field in the new version of the schema. SAS can make a code update. If they don't make the code update, Rails should work just fine. And then that adds the ability for us to introduce these two additional ones, which would be module and endpoint location. Now, do you know if module and endpoint location are used by the fuzzing coverage tool today?
Endpoint, that was when I was thinking this might be used to cover API fuzzing as well. So ignore the endpoint location.
Okay, so we can
module location, definitely.
Okay.
So if you look at the from Yevgeny's demo where the crash state showed like module plus offset, it wasn't line numbers. That's exactly what this is. Like it is a specific module. That's the type equals module. The module is the name of the module, and then an offset into the module. Okay. And it's relative, not based on the specific address in memory, right?
Cool.
Yeah.
So that takes care of the module, the file, we're good. And then there were a couple other things that got added here.
I added stack trace.
Yep.
Which is, where is it?
Right there.
Oh, I just added it in line right here.
Yep.
Okay, so a stack trace is, and this is where the reusable components comes in, right? Is an array of location items.
Right.
Yeah. So it would be module definitions or source. And if we knew how to work with either of them, it would do exactly what you were saying. You could look at the stack trace and jump directly to the source in the project, or it would just show you the module plus offset.
Yep.
And the target was just a string saying the name of the target. Maybe we should change it to some identifier. I'm thinking this would just be the name of the binary it was run with.
Right.
I don't see too much benefit in trying to assign it some unique identifier based on the name.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so I guess next steps is, James, do you want to open up a MR to refactor the schema on the left hand, on the SAS, to just add the type equals file and then pull that into a definition?
Yeah, totally.
Because I think that should be able to, hopefully the SAS team is okay with that, and we should be able to get that through pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And then take the merge request that that we had on the right hand side of the screen, and then just update that accordingly. And then once we have that, I think we can just get Yevgeny's feedback to see if that takes care of everything that he needs outputted.
Sounds good to me. I don't think that will be much work at all.
Okay.
I think I could just work off of this existing merge request.
Yeah.
And update the SAS schema, pull the location object out into something common that both of them can include. And then that's about it.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, no, hopefully, I think that makes sense. Do we want to, the schema is called Fuzz.
It should definitely be renamed. It's not clear. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering what, I don't know what to call it though.
Well, coverage based. I think that's just the name we're going for with that type of fuzzing, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I think this looks good. Yeah, and I guess the other thing too, these schemas are part of the goal behind these is that they're not just internal, right? If anyone else is writing a tool, they can go download this, and then their results are going to just show up in our dashboard.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the interface that we give to third-party integrators and say, if you use this, it works.
Yep.
So we don't have to build anything else custom or bespoke when people want to work with us.
And yeah, so Sam, one of the things that came out of our brainstorming yesterday is, we're going to version these schemas appropriately as per schema version. What we have to do is talk to the Threat Insights team because they're running the dashboard, and they will ultimately, I think, decide what versions of the schema they are going to drop support for. So, if we have whatever, like the number of schemas versions is kind of arbitrary. We could advance it very quickly. And then the Rails engine could say, I'm going to support all 10 of these because it's very simple. Or at some point they may say, okay, we're going to stop support for schema version 2 or version 3 or version 4. And then we'll need to communicate that to any of the integrators that say, hey, if you're pushing code to us or pushing a JSON file, it has to be in version whatever. And we'll probably drop support for older versions, at version 14 of GitLab or whenever.
Yeah, I mean, we'll definitely need a support and deprecation policy for this.
Yep.
And have that clearly listed on here's all the schemas, subscribe to this page if you want to make sure we don't drop your support.
Yeah, and it's going to be the same problem internally as it is externally, right? So SAST may be producing schema at version 2, and at some point Threat Insight says, hey, we can't support schema version 2 anymore, and SAST will have to upgrade to version 3 or whatever.
Sure.
And that's the same communication we'll do internally as we will do externally.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be tricky. We're going to have to figure out what those timelines look like, because at GitLab, we can coordinate internally pretty fast. I mean, it's just a matter of getting on an issue. But once we have external people integrating, I'm thinking probably at least 6 months at a minimum. It's going to be the kind of timelines we're talking about for deprecation.
Absolutely. Yeah. But frankly, most of that work is going to fall on the Threat Insights team, because we're going to need to just output whatever new data we have, like we are for fuzzing or for whatever. And if we need to add a new field, we'll add a new field. And the Threat Insights team will have to figure out how to basically inject old values or inject values into old schemas if they don't.
Yeah, whatever makes sense for us.
Yep. In some cases, that might be a hard-coded value like unknown or a blank string or something to that effect.
Yeah. Yeah, because I don't know if they would go so far as to support multiple renderings per schema version. That sounds pretty expensive to do and maintain.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I would architect it on the Threat Insights team is you read the schema version in, and then you migrate that up to the latest version. So if the field's not there, you inject a value, and then you have one display logic.
I did want to bring up as well, I kept the schema as it is very minimal. When I've written fuzzing frameworks and things to collect crashes before and make UIs for them, there's a lot of other information that you do want to have, such as the crashing instruction itself and all of the registers. That way you don't have to reproduce the crash locally to tell exactly how it's crashing, right? And that does tend to look like, it's say x86 assembly instructions, right? And you'll have a list of registers, possibly surrounding code snippets. Those are all things that I've added in the past. And for MVC, probably don't need it, but I think Yevgeny may already be capturing it. I'm not sure. But it's not that hard to capture. It's part of the libfuzzer or gofuzz output. When there is a crash, it prints all that information out.
Yeah, that's a good point. How much? So the thing that we haven't done yet, and we're kind of on the cusp of having this conversation of, like, for example, like HAR files on API fuzzing or some of this register, like that's a lot of data. And the question is, should that live in this JSON document, or should that live as a link to that data?
Yeah, that's a that's a very good question.
And
Yeah,
I think kind of my gut reaction is to figure out a way to do this extensively, which would be to figure out a way to add basically artifacts, if you will, inside the JSON so that we could do this for any tool. And we don't have to come back and make a lot of changes to the schema. So for example, there might be something like supporting info or whatever, and it has a link to a file. And that could be the case. Maybe it's like supporting info, file name, and then a link to the file. And so if you have that on Dast, Dast could be like, okay, here's this, the file name would be a har file, har replay file or whatever. And then it would be a link to the asset. If you had that on the fuzzing, it could be, you know, your register or memory dump or whatever it is. And that way we don't have to figure out how to have all that data in the schema. And then that's a generally extensible format to assets. And basically it's a name, a file name, and I don't know, maybe some other metadata.
Well, and
We already use that in
if
some
we
of the
did keep
schemas.
information,
There's
Or,
the schemas don't have any links to external data.
I thought we were using that for the suggested solutions.
I believe
Because those are links to patches, I think.
I think those are hashes of the patch. I could be wrong. That's going to be under dependency scanning, isn't it?
Yeah, it should be.
So that's the remediations. That's a good call. So.
Okay, it is a string. Never mind. Yeah, I would agree with your thought though, Seth. Being able to link to arbitrary assets, we're going to use that for more than just fuzz testing. And that seems a whole lot more manageable for users rather than having this 50 megabyte long schema file once it's populated with data.
Yeah, I did. I think I need to add this, or it could be useful for me to add this into the issue about displaying fuzzing results. But I forgot about it until right now. This was a project that I worked on a long time ago, but it uses a CLI tool to, it's a fuzzing framework, and this is specifically viewing a specific crash from the fuzzing framework, right? Everything has an ID, severity or exploitability rating. And again, my attention with this wasn't so much how severe it is, it's more I want to find exploitable bugs so I can exploit them. But this is where I have like crash instruction, crashing module would have gone here, and the registers surrounding, or the registers on the right here, and on the left are the crashing instructions surrounding where the crash actually happened.
Right.
Yeah, so that type of information from a very technical perspective is definitely useful. But for the common use case that we're going for, it's probably overkill. You give a normal, maybe your average developer knows how to write Go raw assembly instructions, it may not mean too much.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we had a structure to link to external assets, that takes care of it. And then certainly that would be a starting point. And then if we find some of this data is really critical, we could promote it into the schema itself.
Yeah. I was hoping Evgeny was going to hop on. I'm curious to know if he had other fields that he thought we needed.
Yeah.
Well, assuming he won't be able to join, do we have what we were hoping to get out of this conversation to move forward until we can all get together again?
Yeah. So,
or are there some missing pieces?
Yeah. So James, let's see. So next steps is we're going to refactor.
Oh, I added a to-do section right under that.
Oh, there it is. Perfect. Refactor, update fuzzing to use the common. Perfect. And then we're removing the, endpoint?
That's right, the endpoint stuff, right?
And then once you have that, I think once we have that, then we could probably have a conversation. You and Evgeny can have a conversation just to make sure that everything that he's displaying today matches with this schema. And if he signs off on that schema, then I think we're good to go on the fuzzing schema.
Awesome. Yep, sounds good to me.
So yeah, when you're ready to go with that, if you want to just coordinate either asynchronously or synchronously, whatever works.
Okay, cool. Will do.
Sounds good.
Oh, and is that it for the meeting? I have a question after.
Yeah. Sam, anything else on the schema? We got a lot done.
No, I think I'm good.
Cool.
Excited to see this moving.
Yeah.